It was the summer of 2019, in late August, when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I was 27 years old then, fit, careful, and experienced enough to know how to prepare for the wilderness, but still eager to challenge myself. I had done shorter hikes before, some multi-day backpacking, but nothing as long and rugged as this one. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant demands of work, and just be alone with my thoughts and nature. The plan was simple. I would hike a 15-mile loop starting from the trailhead near Lincoln, New Hampshire, spending one night camping along the way, then finishing the next day. I packed light but practical. A small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, some granola bars, a small stove, and most importantly, a reliable compass and a map of the trails. I also brought my phone, fully charged, though I knew signal would be patchy or non-existent deep in the forest. I had a good start early on that Saturday morning. The sun was just rising when I pulled my car into the parking lot. It was mostly empty, which I liked, quiet and calm. I stretched, checked my pack one last time, and started walking on the trail marked Mount Liberty Loop. The forest was dense but beautiful, tall pines and birches filtering the light, the ground soft with pine needles and patches of moss. I felt the cool morning air in my lungs and smiled. This was what I needed. The first several miles passed quickly. The trail was well marked, and I kept a steady pace. The climb was moderate but steady, with rocky sections that forced me to watch my footing carefully. The scent of wet earth and pine filled the air. Birds sang occasionally, and I saw a few squirrels darting through the underbrush. I stopped a few times to take photos or drink water, but I kept moving mostly to cover ground before the afternoon heat. Around midday, I reached a small clearing near a brook. The sunlight broke through the trees here, warming a patch of soft grass. I took off my pack, pulled out a sandwich and some water, and rested on a large rock. The sound of running water was peaceful, and I thought about how nice it would be to camp near this spot. But the official campsites were further ahead, so I packed up after eating and continued. By mid-afternoon, the trail became more challenging. It narrowed and twisted around steep inclines and rocky outcroppings. My legs ached, but I felt good, steady, and strong. The map showed that the camping area was about 2 miles ahead, just before the summit ridge. I kept an eye on the trail markers and the time, hoping to reach the site before dusk. As the sun started to lower, I noticed something odd. The forest grew quiet. Not the usual quiet you get deep in the woods, but a strange kind of stillness. No birds, no insects buzzing, no rustling leaves, just silence. It made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they all went quiet for the evening. I reached the camping area just as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was a small, cleared patch with a fire ring and a few flat spots for tents. There were no other campers, which I preferred. I set up my tent carefully, using my headlamp as the daylight faded. The air was cooler now, and a light breeze stirred the trees. After setting up camp, I boiled water for dinner and ate quietly. The forest around me was shadowed but not pitch black, and the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke from distant fires hung in the air. I kept my backpack and gear close by, as always. As night fell fully, I felt that familiar thrill of being alone in the wilderness. But then the silence returned, heavier this time. I lay inside my tent, listening. I heard nothing except the occasional crack of a twig far away and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps on the trail leading to the campsite. My heart jumped. I froze, trying to listen harder. The steps stopped just outside the clearing. No voices, no sounds of a campfire, just footsteps. The trail was a narrow path surrounded by dense forest, and whoever was out there could be watching, maybe waiting. I reached slowly for the bear spray I kept in my tent's front pocket. My fingers trembled slightly. I told myself it was probably another hiker, someone lost or just passing by. But the footsteps never came closer, nor did they move away. They just stopped. Minutes passed, maybe 10 or 15. The tension grew unbearable. I wanted to call out or at least make some noise, but my throat was dry, and fear held my voice back. The footsteps started again, this time moving slowly but deliberately along the trail. moving away from the clearing. I waited a long time after, the silence feeling even heavier. Then, I carefully unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The trail was empty, no signs of anyone or anything. I breathed out slowly, telling myself it was just someone hiking past. Nothing more. I decided to stay awake for a while longer, sitting quietly by my tent with my knife and bear spray close. I thought about packing up and hiking out immediately, but the dark was thick and cold, and the forest too large and unfamiliar to move safely without a light. So I waited, alert but hoping the strange visitor was gone for good. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard another sound, a low rustling, closer this time, coming from the bushes just beyond the fire ring. My pulse raced. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the underbrush. Nothing, just shadows. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept the light scanning the edges of the clearing. Suddenly, something moved fast. A large shape darted from one side of the clearing to the other and disappeared into the trees. I froze, heart pounding. It was too big to be a deer or a fox. Maybe a bear? But the shape was oddly humanoid, tall and quick. I didn't get a good look, but whatever it was had vanished before I could see it clearly. The rest of the night was a blur of nervous listening and uneasy waiting. I didn't sleep much, clutching my knife and bear spray tightly. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, I felt relief wash over me. Packing up was slow but careful. I checked my gear twice and made sure everything was in place. I kept my phone ready, hoping for a signal as I descended. The hike back was nerve-wracking. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone following or hiding. But the forest was quiet, almost empty. No birds, no animals, no footsteps except my own. About halfway down the trail, I found something that stopped me cold. On a rock near the path was a small, crudely made pile of sticks and leaves arranged like a marker. Next to it lay a torn piece of cloth, stained and dirty. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen it on the way in. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been watching. Someone had left that there, maybe as a sign or a warning. I felt exposed and vulnerable, but I kept moving. By late afternoon, I was back at the parking lot, exhausted and tense. My car was still there, untouched. I locked the doors and started driving away without looking back. Later, after showering and eating, I called the local ranger station to report what happened. They told me there had been recent reports of illegal campers and poachers in the area, some known to be dangerous and armed. I realized then how close I had come to something far worse than a quiet night alone. The experience stayed with me long after. I still love hiking and being outdoors, but now I'm more careful. I never go alone without telling someone exactly where I'll be. I carry extra safety gear, and I trust my instincts. That hike taught me something important. Nature can be beautiful and peaceful, but it can also be unpredictable and dangerous. Not because of ghosts or fairy tales, but because of real people, real threats, and the wild unknown. You have to be ready and you have to respect it. I still remember the exact moment when I decided to take that hike. It was a late summer day in 2019, somewhere deep in the Northern Rockies, in Montana. I was 27 years old at the time, living in a small town not far from Glacier National Park. I had been hiking for years, often solo, sometimes with friends, but that summer, I was itching to get back out into the wild by myself. I wanted to clear my head, test my limits, and find some quiet away from the noisy small-town life I was starting to feel trapped in. I had planned a 2-day hike along a ridge trail that ran through a remote area called Granite Peak Wilderness, not far from the park, but less traveled. It was a place I'd read about in old guidebooks. Beautiful, rugged, and rarely crowded. I packed my bag carefully. A lightweight tent, a small stove, dehydrated food, a first aid kit, plenty of water, and some basic survival tools. I also carried my personal safety gear, a small tactical knife in a sheath on my boot, a compact bear spray canister, and a whistle hanging from my pack strap. No fancy gadgets, just what I trusted from years of experience. I started the hike early on a bright Sunday morning. The sun was just creeping above the pine tree line as I laced up my boots and shouldered my pack. The trailhead was quiet except for the sound of birds and the rustle of wind through the high grass. The air was cool but smelled of pine and earth, crisp and fresh. The path was narrow but well-marked, winding up through dense forests that gave way to stunning open views of jagged peaks and rolling valleys. The first few hours passed easily. The trail was steady uphill but manageable, and I kept a slow, steady pace. I stopped a few times to catch my breath and drink water, enjoying the distant sound of a creek tumbling over rocks. The sun rose higher, warming the earth and lighting the landscape with golden hues. I felt good, strong, calm, alert. As the morning turned into afternoon, the forest began to thin out. The trees gave way to rocky outcroppings and grassy meadows dotted with wildflowers. I reached a small ridge that offered a breathtaking panorama. Miles of mountain ranges fading into the horizon under a vast, clear blue sky. I pulled out my camera to take a few pictures, the kind I always took to remember moments like these. The wind was steady but gentle, carrying the scent of sage and damp stone. I ate a quick snack, a granola bar and some dried fruit, then packed everything up and kept moving. The trail ahead looked a bit tougher. Steeper inclines, loose gravel, and more exposed rock faces. But I was prepared, and I liked the challenge. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a spot marked on my map as the Fork, where the trail split into two paths. One led down to a small lake nestled in a valley. The other followed the ridge further east. I had planned to stay on the ridge to reach a campsite near a high meadow about 3 miles ahead. I chose the ridge path and continued. The terrain became rockier and less forgiving. My boots crunched on loose stones, and I had to be careful where I placed my feet. The wind picked up, blowing colder now that I was higher up. Dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, a sign of a coming storm. I felt a slight unease but pushed it aside. I was used to Montana's sudden weather changes. About an hour later, the first drops of rain started falling, light and scattered at first, then heavier. I put on my rain jacket and slowed my pace, hoping to reach the meadow campsite before the storm grew worse. The trail became slick and slippery, forcing me to take extra care. I noticed something odd just then. The trail seemed less defined. The markers were fewer, the worn path fading among rocks and sparse vegetation. I checked my map again. According to it, I was still on course, but the terrain made it hard to be sure. The rain came down in sheets now, cold and sharp. Visibility dropped. I pulled out my compass to double-check direction and realized I'd taken a wrong turn. Somehow, I had veered slightly off the trail at a fork I hadn't noticed in the growing gloom. Panic didn't set in right away. I reminded myself that I had experience and survival skills. But as the storm worsened, the forest around me thickened and darkened. The wind howled through the pines, and the trail was gone, swallowed by mud and fallen branches. I knew I had to find shelter fast. I scanned the area and spotted a rocky overhang about 50 yards away. I made my way toward it carefully, slipping a couple of times but managing to keep my footing. The overhang offered some protection from the rain, enough to keep me dry. I took a deep breath, unpacked my emergency blanket, and wrapped it around myself. I pulled out a small pocket knife to cut some dry twigs I found under the rocks, trying to start a fire. It took time and patience, but after several attempts, a small flame flickered and grew. The warmth was a relief in the cold storm. I sat by the fire, wet and shivering, listening to the storm rage around me. I felt a creeping fear, not of the storm, but of being lost alone in the wilderness as darkness fell. Night came early behind the storm clouds, and the forest felt alive with sounds. Branches snapping, distant animal calls, the whistle of wind. I stayed close to the fire, watching shadows move in the flickering light. Hours passed. Then I heard something else. A faint noise, barely audible over the rain and wind. A crunching, slow but steady, like footsteps on wet leaves and broken branches. It was too rhythmic to be a random animal. Something was moving toward me. I froze, heart pounding. I gripped my bear spray tightly, ready to defend myself. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I couldn't see anything through the rain and darkness beyond the firelight. Then I caught a glimpse of movement, figures, indistinct but definitely human. Fear surged through me. Who could be out here, in this weather, so deep in the wilderness? I reminded myself to stay calm. Maybe hikers caught in the storm like me. The figures stayed just outside the firelight, silent, watching. My mind raced. I didn't have my phone signal out here, no way to call for help. I was on my own. I felt trapped between the rocky overhang and the dark forest. I thought of my options. Run? Hide? Confront? I stayed still, hoping the fire and my presence would deter them. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated slowly, disappearing into the night. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire dwindling to embers, watching the shadows. By dawn, the storm passed, leaving a damp, cold morning. The forest was quiet again. I packed up quickly, keeping my knife and bear spray ready. I retraced my steps back toward the main trail, following the compass carefully this time. Hours later, exhausted and wet but safe, I found the trail and eventually the ranger station near the park boundary. I told them what happened, about losing the trail, the storm, and the strange figures. They took it seriously, mentioning recent reports of illegal poachers and campers trespassing deep in the wilderness. I was shaken but relieved. That experience taught me many things about preparation, caution, and the raw, sometimes dangerous reality of wilderness alone. Since then, I never hike without telling someone exactly where I'm going, carrying extra safety gear, and trusting my instincts. The mountains are beautiful and wild, but respect and caution are the only way to keep safe. I'm grateful I made it back that day and that the strange visitors never got closer. Now, every time I plan a hike, I remember that night on the ridge, the cold rain, the fire, the silent footsteps, and I carry those lessons with me. My name is Sarah, and in the summer of 2019, I was 27 years old. I had been hiking for years, always solo, always prepared, and I had never experienced anything truly scary. I liked the solitude, the challenge, the way nature made me feel alive but small. That summer, I decided to explore a trail I hadn't been on before, a lesser-known path in the northern part of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state. It was called the Windfall Ridge Trail. I had found it on an old hiking forum, a narrow track through dense forest and steep ridges that promised stunning views and, according to one brief post, an experience unlike any other. It was described as off the beaten path, and that's exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no noise, just the quiet wilderness and me. I packed carefully. My backpack was heavy but well balanced. I had the basics: water purifier, extra food, first aid kit, a lightweight tarp, my trusted multi-tool, and some self-defense gear. A small boot knife strapped to my ankle, a can of bear spray, and an air horn. My phone had a GPS app loaded with offline maps, but I kept in mind that signal could be spotty or non-existent. I drove to the trailhead early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The air was cool and crisp. The parking lot was empty except for one or two vehicles belonging to other early hikers or campers. I double-checked my gear, laced up my boots tightly, and started walking. The first part of the trail was gentle, winding through thick stands of Douglas firs and western red cedars. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns and moss, and every so often, patches of wildflowers brightened the shadows with splashes of yellow and purple. The birds were lively. The occasional call of a woodpecker echoed through the trees. It was peaceful in a way that felt sacred, the kind of quiet that settles deep in your bones. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trail narrowed. It was clear that few people passed this way regularly. Fallen branches and thick undergrowth brushed against my legs, and I had to duck under low-hanging limbs. The air was heavier here, moist with the scent of damp earth and pine resin. The GPS showed the trail curving sharply to the left, leading up the ridge. I paused for a drink of water and a quick snack of trail mix. My legs ached a bit from the steady uphill, but nothing serious. The rhythm of my steps and breathing was steady and calm. I felt good. Then something changed. The forest grew quieter. The birdsong faded until I could hear only the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant murmur of a creek. The sky above thickened with gray clouds, dimming the light. The path became muddier, the soil soft from recent rains. I kept going, but the sense of peace I had moments before now felt fragile, as if I were intruding on a secret. I noticed the trees around me were older here, taller, their trunks wider and scarred by years of weather. Some were snapped or fallen, creating natural barriers across the trail. I had to carefully climb over one big log that was slick with moss. My hands slipped once, and I barely caught myself on a rough branch. The trail marker was a small red blaze painted on a tree, but I almost missed it. I could tell this part of the trail wasn't maintained often. That thought made me more alert. About 2 hours into this section, I came across an intersection the map hadn't marked. There were no signs or blazes here, only two paths, one veering sharply downhill and one continuing up the ridge. I stopped and consulted my GPS. The signal was weak, and the map showed the ridge path curving forward, but I couldn't tell for sure which trail I was on. I felt uneasy. The downhill trail looked wider and easier, but I was sure the ridge trail was the right one. I decided to take the uphill path, trusting my instincts. The path was rough, filled with loose stones and exposed roots. My boots slipped occasionally, and I had to slow down to keep my balance. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned, opening up small patches where I could see distant peaks peeking through the clouds. But then the clouds thickened again, and a light drizzle began. I pulled out my rain jacket and zipped it up. The temperature dropped noticeably. I decided to stop and put on my waterproof pants. I sat on a fallen log to do this, the wet wood cold and rough beneath me. While adjusting my gear, I heard a sound behind me, a snapping branch, like someone stepping on dry twigs. I froze, listening carefully. The forest was quiet again, except for the drizzle falling on leaves. No birds, no wind. I waited, heart pounding. Nothing. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. I stood up and took a deep breath to calm down. I reminded myself that being alert was normal out here. My phone's battery was now showing low. I had been hiking for almost 4 hours, and the signal was still poor. I pushed forward. The path grew steeper, and the soil was slick with rain. I gripped nearby trees and rocks for support, trying not to slip. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing near the top of the ridge. The view was breathtaking. Thick forests rolled away in every direction, and beyond, the jagged peaks of the Cascades rose under heavy clouds. I took a moment to rest and drink water, savoring the sight. Then I checked my GPS again. It blinked a warning, low battery, only 10% left. Panic stirred in my chest. I needed to get to camp before dark, and I hadn't seen any signs of it yet. I pressed onward. The trail here was almost invisible. I had to guess the path by following faint animal tracks and broken branches. The trees were spaced farther apart, and the ground was rocky, with sharp stones jutting out. I felt a sense of isolation deepen. The wind picked up, howling faintly through the ridge. The rain stopped, but the clouds were still thick and gray, casting the forest in a dull light. I moved cautiously, but then my foot caught on a root, and I fell hard against a rock. A sharp pain flared in my right wrist and ankle. I swallowed the urge to cry out. I tested my wrist. It was swollen and tender but didn't seem broken. My ankle hurt more. Stepping on it was painful, but I could still put some weight on it. I knew I had to keep moving. After a few more minutes, the trail dipped slightly down the ridge into a narrow ravine. The air was colder here, damp and musty. The trees closed in again, their branches twisting overhead like a roof. The ground was thick with leaves and broken twigs. That's when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. The trees had strange marks on their trunks, deep scratches that looked too straight and deliberate to be from animals. They ran high and low, as if made by someone dragging something sharp. I stopped and looked around. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Then, further ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of footprints. Not animal prints. Human footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft mud. They moved forward, deeper into the ravine. I wasn't alone. I looked behind me, no one. I tried to think rationally. Maybe hikers had been here before, maybe hunters. But why would they leave such clear marks on the trees? Why were the prints so large and heavy? They didn't look like a normal hiking boot. The prints were irregular, as if someone was dragging their feet. I swallowed hard. The sun was beginning to set, but the sky was still light enough to see. I decided to follow the prints cautiously, hoping they might lead to a trail or camp. I moved slowly, keeping my eyes on the path. The prints led to a clearing where an abandoned campsite sat. A circle of stones with a burnt-out fire pit, scattered ashes, and an empty food container. I inspected the site. The fire looked recent, maybe a few hours old. I found broken twigs arranged near the pit, like someone had tried to make another fire but left quickly. That's when I noticed it. A small, crude trap made of rope and bent branches, tied tightly around a narrow path where animals or people might pass. I felt a chill. Someone else was here, someone who knew this trail very well. I decided not to stay. I gathered my things and moved back to the ravine entrance. But then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural. Not an animal, closer than I wanted to imagine. I ran. My ankle screamed with every step, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted up the ravine path, branches whipping at my face and arms. The growl turned into a shout. Not a word, just a sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't look back. I stumbled and fell hard again, scraping my hands on sharp rocks. My backpack caught on a branch and tore slightly. I scrambled up, limping, and forced myself to keep moving. The forest seemed endless. Every turn looked the same, shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. I thought I had lost whoever was chasing me, but then I heard footsteps crashing through the brush behind me. I picked up my pace, ignoring the pain in my ankle and wrist. I remembered the air horn in my pack. Reaching back with one hand, I fumbled. I always found peace in the mountains. The way the pine trees swayed gently in the wind, the smell of damp earth and fresh moss, the cool air brushing past my face as I moved slowly upward on the trail. All of it made me feel alive. For as long as I could remember, hiking alone was how I cleared my head, away from the constant noise of city life. It was May 2019 when I planned my solo hike along the Cascade Ridge Trail, a path that hugged the edge of a long stretch of wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. I was 27 then, fit and confident in my skills. I'd done longer hikes and tougher terrain. The trail was about 15 miles round trip, starting at a small trailhead near a sleepy mountain town called Cedar Creek. I packed light but smart. A day pack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, a compass, a multi-tool, a whistle, and my bear spray tucked securely in a side pocket. I also had my knife in a sheath strapped to my boot, just in case. I brought a small flashlight and my phone, though I knew the signal would be spotty out there. The morning air was crisp but warming as the sun climbed over the ridges. The sky was a clear blue, no clouds in sight. I locked my car, shouldered my pack, and started up the narrow dirt path. The first mile was easy, the ground soft with pine needles, and the scent of fir trees thick in the air. Birds called out in the distance, and small rustlings in the bushes told me the forest was alive. The trail gradually climbed, winding around rocky outcrops and crossing a narrow creek on a shaky wooden footbridge. My boots crunched over dry leaves and scattered twigs. Every step took me higher, and the views opened up to the valley below, a patchwork of green fields and dark woods, with the occasional glint of a river far off. I stopped after 2 hours to rest on a large boulder overlooking a clearing. I drank water and munched on a granola bar, savoring the quiet. The sun was warm on my skin, but the shade of the trees offered relief. Around me, wildflowers peeked through the undergrowth, small purple lupins and delicate white trilliums. The forest floor was alive with tiny insects and the occasional bright red salamander that darted away quickly. I felt good, strong, and at peace, but I also knew the trail would get tougher. After the clearing, the path narrowed and became steeper, winding through thick stands of fir and spruce. I tightened my backpack straps and pressed on. About 4 miles in, the trail switched back sharply up the hillside. My heart pounded with exertion. The forest grew quieter here. No birdsong, just the rustling of branches in the wind and the distant sound of water rushing somewhere below. The air smelled of pine sap and wet earth. The ground beneath me shifted from packed dirt to loose gravel in places, making footing tricky. At one point, I slipped slightly on a patch of moss-covered rock, catching myself with my hands. My palms were scraped, but not badly. I paused to shake the dirt off my jeans and check my map. The trail should turn right up ahead, just beyond a small ridge. I moved carefully, boots gripping the rocky surface. Then I noticed something odd. There were faint footprints in the soft mud near the edge of the trail. They looked fresh, the kind made by a heavy boot or maybe a work shoe. I froze, scanning the woods around me. No one was visible. No voices, no signs of movement. The footprints led off the trail, descending into a narrow ravine filled with thick brush and tangled roots. I hesitated. Normally, I would never stray from the trail, especially alone. But my curiosity got the better of me. Maybe someone was lost or hurt. I edged down carefully into the ravine, slipping over mossy rocks and ducking under low branches. As I reached the bottom, the sun was blocked by the thick canopy above. The temperature dropped a few degrees. The air smelled damp and musty. I saw a small, battered backpack half hidden under a pile of leaves and branches. I picked it up cautiously. It was empty except for a crumpled water bottle. No identification, no food, no gear. My heart started to beat faster. Why would someone leave a backpack like this in the middle of nowhere? Was someone nearby? Were they in trouble? Should I call for help? But my phone had no signal here. I decided to head back to the trail. When I turned to climb back up, I noticed another set of footprints, this time heading uphill, away from the ravine, deeper into the woods. They were heavier, like the tread of a work boot. Something about them didn't feel right. I hurried back to the trail and continued upward, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker who had dumped their gear, or a worker from a nearby logging road. The trail opened up again after a half mile, rising to the ridge crest. The wind picked up sharply here, whipping my hair and tugging at my jacket. The trees were thinner, stunted by the exposure, their twisted limbs reaching out like fingers. I paused at the edge of the ridge and looked out. The valley stretched out beneath me, the mountains rolling away in every direction. The sky was still clear, but clouds had gathered low to the west. I took a deep breath and started along the narrow path that ran just beneath the ridge line. This was the most exposed part of the trail. A steep drop on one side, thick forest on the other. The wind roared in my ears, and I had to keep my balance carefully. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, rumbling sound rising and falling through the trees. But then it grew louder, sharper, a snapping of branches, like someone stepping through brush off to my left. I stopped, frozen. My eyes scanned the undergrowth. No movement, no shape, just the shifting shadows of the trees. I swallowed hard and reached for my bear spray. The sound came again, a sharp crack, closer this time. Then the faint rustle of leaves, like something running. I didn't hesitate. I spun around and sprinted along the trail, heart pounding in my chest. The steep drop was on my right and the forest thick on my left. I didn't look back, but I could hear footsteps, fast, heavy, chasing me. I ran harder, my lungs burning, legs trembling. The trail twisted sharply downhill now, the surface rocky and uneven. I stumbled once but caught myself. Ahead, I saw the outline of a large tree fallen across the trail, half blocking the path. I had no choice but to climb over it, scraping my hands and knees on rough bark. The footsteps behind me were getting closer. I could almost feel the breath of whoever was chasing me. When I reached the base of the slope, I veered off the trail into the thick trees. The undergrowth scratched at my arms and legs as I pushed through, desperate to hide. I dropped to the ground behind a large cedar and tried to steady my breathing. The footsteps passed near me, heavy, deliberate. I stayed still, heart hammering in my ears, eyes wide in the dim light. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. I could hear breathing, rough and ragged, somewhere nearby. I stayed as quiet as I could for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I waited several more minutes before crawling back to the trail. My hands were shaking, my clothes torn and dirty. I didn't know who had been chasing me or why, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I started running again, this time heading downhill as fast as I could. The wind had picked up even more, whipping the branches around me. My headlamp was in my pack, but I didn't want to stop to get it. I wanted to reach the car before dark. I heard voices then, faint, distant. I followed the sound until the trees thinned and I emerged onto the lower trailhead, just as the last light faded from the sky. A couple of hikers were there, finishing their own day hike. They didn't see me at first. I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. But when I explained where I'd been and what happened, they immediately called the ranger station on their phone. Within an hour, the rangers arrived. They searched the area I described, but found no one, no evidence, no sign of the footprints or backpack. The rangers told me it might have been a hunter or illegal worker who didn't want to be found, that the forest was wild and sometimes dangerous in ways you couldn't always see. I went home that night exhausted, with a new respect for how quickly things could turn from peaceful to terrifying in the wilderness. I never went back to Cascade Ridge alone, and I never stopped carrying my bear spray and knife. The forest is beautiful and quiet, but it's also unpredictable. You never know who or what might be out there watching, waiting. I learned that day to trust my instincts, to respect the wild, and above all, never to hike alone without a plan to get help. If you ever find yourself out there, remember, the mountains don't owe you safety. It's your job to be prepared, alert, and ready to get out fast. That was the scariest hike of my life, but it ended with me safe and wiser. It was early September of 2022 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip deep into the Pacific Northwest. I had been wanting to push myself further on the trails I knew, to hike alone for a few days, to experience something real and raw out there. I was 28 at the time, an avid hiker but not an expert in survival or wilderness navigation. My friends often teased me about my love for solo trips, but for me, it was a way to disconnect, to find peace, and to prove to myself that I could handle the wild on my own. I picked the Cedar Ridge Trail, a well-known path winding through dense forest, moss-covered trees, and rocky ridges. The trail was rated moderately difficult, about 15 miles round trip with some elevation gain, and I had done similar hikes before. I packed lightly, a good backpack with water, a small stove, food for 2 days, a map, compass, first aid kit, a flashlight, and my trusty multi-tool. I also carried bear spray and a small boot knife, items I felt were necessary for solo hiking out here. The weather was clear and crisp, the kind of early autumn day where the air smells fresh with pine and earth, and the sun filters through the leaves in golden shafts. I started early in the morning, the forest still wet with dew. The trailhead was quiet, the parking lot nearly empty, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the distant calls of birds waking up. As I walked, I felt the familiar rhythm of nature, the cool breeze brushing against my face, the rustling of leaves, the steady thump of my heart. The trail rose steadily at first, winding through thick clusters of fir and cedar. Ferns and moss covered the ground like a soft carpet, and occasional wildflowers peeked out between the rocks. I took my time, stopping every so often to take pictures or to sip water. The trail was well marked, painted blazes on trees guiding me through. I felt calm and focused, enjoying the solitude. Around midday, I reached a small clearing with a stunning view of a nearby lake shimmering in the sunlight. I sat down on a fallen log and ate some trail mix while looking out over the water. The sky was bright blue, not a cloud in sight. After the break, I pressed on toward the ridge. The trail became steeper, and the trees thinner, revealing rocky outcrops covered with lichens. The wind picked up, colder now, and I put on my jacket. I was alone, yes, but I never felt lonely. Nature was company enough. As I reached the top of the ridge, the view opened up completely. I could see the valley below, the patches of forest stretching toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows through the trees. I pulled out my map and compass to check my location, confirming I was on track for the campsite I planned to reach before nightfall. Then something odd caught my eye. Off to the right, near the edge of the ridge, there was a faint plume of smoke curling upward through the trees. It was small, thin, and distant, but unmistakable. Someone else was out here. I hadn't seen another hiker all day. The smoke looked like it came from a campfire, but the time was late afternoon, and the trail to the nearest campsite was still a few miles away. I debated for a moment whether to investigate or continue on my path. My instincts told me to stay on the trail, but curiosity nudged me forward. I cautiously moved off the main path, edging closer to where the smoke rose. The forest grew denser here, darker under the thick canopy, the ground uneven with roots and rocks. After about 15 minutes of careful walking, I spotted the fire. It was small, surrounded by a ring of stones, and smoldering. No one was there. The area showed signs of recent use, a few footprints in the soft earth, a crushed soda can. Whoever was here had left not long ago. Unease crept up my spine. I scanned the surroundings but saw no movement. The forest was still almost too quiet. My heart began to beat faster. I decided to return to the main trail and keep going toward the campsite. I didn't want to waste daylight wandering around someone else's camp. As I turned back, I heard something low rustling, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, listening. Nothing followed. Still, I picked up my pace. Back on the trail, the forest felt different. The light was fading, and shadows stretched between the trees like fingers. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting nerves get the better of me. I'd been hiking alone plenty of times before and was prepared. Still, the feeling that I was being watched didn't go away. I reached the campsite just as the sun disappeared behind the ridge. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a wooden sign marking the site number. I set up my tent quickly, wanting to finish before dark. The air turned colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter. Once my tent was secure, I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire. The crackle of flames was comforting. I cooked a simple meal on my stove, ate slowly while watching the embers glow, and took a moment to breathe in the night air. That's when I heard the noise. It started faintly, soft footsteps crunching through leaves, breaking twigs. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon curious about the fire. But the steps were deliberate and steady, coming closer from the trail that led into the campsite. My heart pounded harder. I grabbed my bear spray and kept my boot knife within reach, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest was dark now, shadows blending together. The only light came from my fire. The footsteps stopped just beyond the firelight. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a sudden rustle to my left, near the underbrush. I held my breath, every muscle tense. After what felt like forever, the rustling stopped. I strained my eyes, but couldn't see anything. I tried to stay calm. Whoever or whatever it was, I wasn't gonna panic. I had my tools, my fire, and my awareness. Slowly, I stood up and shined my flashlight toward the noise. The beam caught something, an old backpack partially hidden behind a bush. I approached cautiously, shining my light over the area. The backpack was worn, dusty, and empty. No sign of its owner. Suddenly, a crack behind me made me whirl around. The fire flickered as a gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending leaves swirling. I was alone again. Despite that, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The abandoned backpack only made it worse. Who had left it here? Why? I stayed by the fire as long as I could, scanning the darkness beyond the light. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I crawled into my tent with the bear spray close, the knife tucked in my sleeping bag. Sleep was restless. Every little sound made me jump. The wind through branches, distant animal calls, the snap of a twig. My mind kept replaying the footsteps and the empty backpack. I wondered if I should pack up and leave at first light. Morning came gray and damp, the forest shrouded in mist. I decided to cut the hike short, return to the trailhead, and get back to safety. I packed quickly, doused the fire, and started down the trail. The morning air was cold, and the ground slick with dew. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest seemed peaceful again, but the tension hadn't fully left me. About a mile down the trail, I saw something else. A figure standing still beside a tree, half hidden by shadows. I stopped dead. The figure didn't move. It wasn't wearing a backpack or carrying gear, just a dark jacket and worn boots. I gripped my bear spray, heart racing. After a moment, the figure turned and vanished into the trees. I quickened my pace, adrenaline pushing me faster down the trail. My boots pounded the ground, the forest blurring past. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, where my car was parked. Safe and in daylight, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I realized then how close I had been to danger, not from wild animals or nature's elements, but from something human. Someone who had been watching me, maybe following me. I never saw the person again, never found out who they were or what they wanted. But I learned that the wilderness is unpredictable, and sometimes the scariest threats aren't from the wild itself, but from others who share it. I haven't gone back to Cedar Ridge since, but I haven't stopped hiking either. I just make sure I'm better prepared, more cautious, and always aware that out here, you're never truly alone. I'm Emma, 27 years old, and I've been hiking and camping alone for a few years now. I love the quiet, the challenge, and the feeling of being out in nature, away from the noise of everyday life. This story happened in the summer of 2022 on a trail called Rimrock Trail in northern Arizona. The area is known for its beautiful rock formations, deep canyons, and sparse pine forests. I had done some research before going, packed carefully, and felt ready for a weekend solo hike. But what happened on that trip is something I won't forget. I left my apartment in Flagstaff early on a Friday morning, excited for the adventure. The drive to the trailhead was about an hour, winding through pine forests and patches of desert scrub. The sky was clear and bright, and the weather was perfect, not too hot, with a light breeze. I parked my car, checked my backpack once more. Water, snacks, a map, compass, first aid kit, extra layers, my trusty boot knife strapped to my belt, bear spray in my hand, and a small taser tucked in my jacket pocket, just in case. I always made sure I had some way to protect myself. The area wasn't known for big predators, but you never knew what could happen. The trail started out easy, a wide dirt path that curved gently around giant sandstone cliffs. I followed the marked signs, watching my step carefully. The ground was dry but firm, dotted with small rocks and pine needles. Birds chirped occasionally, and a few squirrels darted across the path. I felt peaceful and energized. After about 2 hours, I reached a fork in the trail. The left path was marked Rimrock Overlook, promising a view of the canyon's edge, while the right was Lost Pine Trail, which I had read was less traveled and more rugged. I decided to take the less traveled path, craving a bit of solitude and challenge. I figured I could loop back to the overlook later. The Lost Pine Trail quickly became narrow and steep. The trees grew denser, and the forest floor was covered with thick roots and fallen branches. The air smelled fresher here, cooler under the shade. I kept my pace steady, mindful of my footing. Occasionally, I paused to drink water or take pictures of wildflowers clinging to the rocks. After another hour, I reached a small clearing with a stream trickling through. I knelt to refill my water bottle, grateful for the fresh source. The sound of water was soothing after the quiet forest. I checked my map and compass. According to my calculations, I was on track to meet the Rimrock Overlook Trail again in about 2 miles. Feeling confident, I pressed on. But then things started to feel off. The trail became less clear. The markers were sparse, faded by weather and time. The dirt path turned into patches of bare rock, and I had to climb over fallen trees and boulders. My boots scraped against jagged stones, and my legs burned with effort. I slowed down, paying close attention to the terrain. At one point, I stopped and looked around. The forest seemed different. The trees were taller and older, with thick bark and twisted branches. The air smelled mustier, like damp earth. The light filtering through the canopy dimmed, casting strange shadows on the ground. For a moment, I felt like I was being watched, a feeling I've had before but never liked. I shook it off and checked my compass. The needle was spinning oddly. I pulled out my phone to check GPS, but the signal was weak and flickered out. No surprise. I had told myself I was prepared for this, that I could navigate with my map and compass alone. Still, my stomach tightened. I decided to stop and eat a snack, sitting on a fallen log. I pulled out a granola bar and took a few bites, scanning the trees around me. I noticed some broken branches at waist height, as if someone or something had passed through recently. That made me pause. I pulled out my bear spray and held it loosely in my hand. Then I checked the taser in my pocket, reassuring myself. It was silly to be scared, but I wasn't stupid. After a few minutes, I stood up, packed my things, and moved forward, more cautiously. An hour later, I realized I was lost. The path had disappeared entirely. I was surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The map showed a rough trail crossing near here, but I couldn't see anything but trees and rocks. I checked my compass again. It pointed roughly north, but I couldn't tell if I was facing the right way. I sat down on a rock, trying to stay calm. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back. I took several deep breaths, reminding myself of the basics. Stay put if you're unsure. Try to find landmarks. Don't panic. I pulled out my whistle and blew it twice, loud and sharp, hoping someone might hear. The sound echoed weirdly through the forest but was met only by silence. My phone still had no signal. I looked at my watch. I had been hiking for about 6 hours total, and the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. I had a headlamp in my pack, but I didn't want to be out here after dark unless absolutely necessary. I decided to try to retrace my steps. Slowly, carefully, I followed what I thought was the way I had come. I marked trees with bright strips of cloth from my pack to keep track. The forest closed in more as I moved. I slipped once on loose gravel, scraping my shin against a rock. The pain was sharp but manageable. I cleaned the scrape with water from my bottle and wrapped it with a bandage from my first aid kit. Then I heard something. At first, it was faint, a snapping of twigs somewhere behind me. I froze, listening. My breath caught. The sound stopped. I started walking again, faster now. After a few steps, the noise came again, closer this time. A soft crunch, like someone stepping carefully over leaves and sticks. My heart leapt. Was someone else out here? Another hiker? Or something else? I stopped again, crouching behind a thick tree trunk. I held my breath, gripping my bear spray tightly. The sound moved past me, but I couldn't see anyone. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I didn't want to reveal my position. The silence stretched. I waited for several minutes, then decided to move. My instincts screamed at me to get out of here, away from whoever or whatever was nearby. As I hurried through the woods, the light was fading fast. I pulled out my headlamp and turned it on, the beam cutting a path through the thick underbrush. Then I stumbled over something soft and heavy. I looked down. It was a backpack, worn and dirty, with no name tag. It looked like it had been left here for a while. Inside, I found a few supplies: a half-empty water bottle, some old granola bars, a small first aid kit, and a crumpled map. I studied the map carefully. It was old and faded, but showed a faint trail running down a steep ridge to a dirt road that led to a ranger station. That was my best bet to safety. The problem was getting there. The ridge looked dangerous. Steep cliffs on either side, loose rocks, and dry shrubs that could easily snap underfoot. I didn't like heights, but I didn't have much choice. I strapped the backpack to my back, grateful for the extra water, and started down the ridge. Every step was a test. The dirt crumbled under my boots. I used my hands to grab onto rocks and branches for support. My legs shook from strain and fear. At one point, I slipped and caught myself just before sliding off the edge. My hands were scratched and bleeding a little. I took a moment to rest, breathing heavily, then kept going. After what felt like hours, I reached the bottom of the ridge and found the dirt road. I followed the road, hoping it would lead me to the ranger station. My phone still had no signal, so I kept walking, headlamp beam ahead, eyes alert for any sign of help. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. I waved my arms frantically until the vehicle slowed and stopped. It was a park ranger. He gave me water and a radio to call for backup. I told him where I had been lost and what had happened. The ranger said they had been looking for me since late afternoon after I didn't check in at the trailhead on time. A search party was ready to come out at first light. I was safe. Back at the ranger station, I cleaned my wounds, ate a hot meal, and called my family to let them know I was okay. The next day, I learned that the broken branches and footsteps I had seen in the forest belonged to a group of illegal hunters who were known to be dangerous and aggressive in the area. They had moved through the forest near the trail, which explained why I felt watched. Had I tried to stay out longer or ignore the signs, I might have run into them. That trip taught me a lot about respect for nature, preparation, and trusting my instincts. Even the best plans can go wrong, and the wilderness is unpredictable. Since then, I always check in with rangers before heading out, carry extra safety gear, and never underestimate the importance of knowing your route. I still hike and love it, but that day on Rimrock Trail changed how I see the world and how I stay safe in it. I've been planning this trip for months. A solo hiking expedition in the Oregon Cascades during early fall, when the trees start to turn and the air carries a cold edge. I wanted something challenging but manageable, something to clear my head, away from the city noise and the never-ending cycle of work and obligations. I've been hiking before, plenty of times, and felt confident in my skills and gear. I had the basics: a sturdy backpack, a map, compass, GPS device, first aid kit, enough food and water, a small tent, and my trusted multi-tool. My name is Rachel, I'm 28, and this trip was supposed to be a break, a peaceful time in nature. I'd picked a route called the Rainbow Ridge Trail. It's known for its steep climbs, dense forests, and stunning views of the surrounding mountains. The trail was about 15 miles round trip, which seemed perfect for a 2-day trip with a night camping under the stars. I set off early in the morning of September 15th, 2023, feeling the crisp, cold air and the smell of damp earth and pine. The first several hours went smoothly. The trail was well marked, and I passed a few other hikers heading the opposite way. The forest was dense but beautiful, sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting green and gold patterns on the ground. I paused often to take pictures, breathe deeply, and enjoy the quiet hum of nature. The distant chirping of birds, the rustling of squirrels, the steady crunch of my boots on the trail. By midday, I reached a small clearing on a ridge with a breathtaking view of Mount Jefferson in the distance, its snow-capped peak shining bright against the blue sky. I stopped to eat a sandwich, drink some water, and check my GPS. Everything looked good. The trail ahead seemed steep but manageable. After lunch, the trail became rougher. Rocks and roots jutted out, and the slope steepened. I concentrated on every step, careful not to twist an ankle. The forest thickened, the canopy closing overhead, blocking most of the sunlight. I felt the temperature drop. The air smelled wetter here, more moss and decaying leaves. That's when I made a mistake. I was so focused on the rocky path that I didn't notice the trail marker had been knocked down. Could have been by animals or weather, I don't know. I trusted my GPS to guide me, but the signal started to flicker. The trees were thick, the sky barely visible, and the device's screen glitched. I thought I knew the way well enough and kept moving uphill. About an hour later, I realized I hadn't seen another trail marker for a while. The forest around me felt strange, still, silent except for the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. I stopped to look at my GPS again. The screen froze for a moment, then showed a blinking red that was moving off the trail path. My stomach tightened. I was lost. Panic didn't hit me right away. I tried to stay calm and rational. I checked the map in my backpack, looked for natural landmarks, and tried to backtrack to the last known marker. The terrain was rougher now, steeper slopes and loose rocks. As I turned to retrace my steps, I slipped on a wet patch of moss-covered rock. My foot went out from under me, and I fell hard onto my right wrist. Pain shot through my arm. I sat for a moment, breathing hard, trying to assess the damage. My wrist throbbed, and when I moved my hand, it felt weak and unsteady. I realized I'd probably sprained it badly, maybe worse. I had to keep moving, but with one good arm, it was tough. I wrapped my wrist tightly with the elastic bandage from my first aid kit. I had to rely mostly on my left hand to steady myself on the rocks and branches as I slowly tried to find the trail. The sun was already dropping low in the sky, and shadows lengthened between the trees. The forest darkened quickly. My heart beat faster. I knew I needed to find a safe place to camp, or at least somewhere I could rest and reassess in the morning. I looked around and found a flat area beneath a thick stand of fir trees. It was damp but sheltered enough from the wind. I set up my small tent, though it was frustrating to do it one-handed. I stuffed leaves and moss inside the tent for insulation, then ate the last of my energy bars and sipped from my water bottle. The cold crept in as night came. I shivered inside my sleeping bag, my wrist aching and throbbing with every movement. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, distant calls of unknown animals, the crack of twigs. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I turned on my headlamp and checked my GPS one last time. It showed I was several hundred meters off the trail, deeper into the forest. The battery was low. I had maybe a few hours left before it would die. I tried to calm my mind. I knew panicking would only make things worse. I planned to wait until daylight to try to navigate back to the trail. I rationed my water and food, hoping to stretch supplies for a couple more days if needed. I wrapped my wrist again with more bandages, trying to immobilize it. Sleep came fitfully. Every noise startled me awake. My mind played tricks, imagining sounds of footsteps or animals approaching. I reminded myself to stay focused, to keep my wits about me. Morning came gray and cold, with thick mist hanging low over the forest floor. I packed up slowly, careful not to aggravate my wrist. I took out the compass and map and tried to pinpoint my location relative to the trail. The GPS was dead. I decided to follow the stream nearby, hoping it would lead to a larger river or trail. I moved slowly, one step at a time, leaning on a thick branch for support. The ground was slippery and uneven, with roots tangled like ropes. Every few minutes I stopped to rest, breathing hard. Hours passed, and the forest gradually thinned. The trees grew taller and more spaced out, and I heard the faint sound of a road or cars in the distance. Hope filled me, but I stayed cautious. Eventually, I reached a dirt road, the kind used by logging trucks and forest rangers. It was a relief. I started walking along it, knowing it would lead to some kind of civilization. As I walked, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. A pickup truck came down the road, slowing when it saw me. I raised my good arm, signaling for help. The driver stopped and helped me climb into the cab. They called emergency services, and soon a rescue team arrived. My wrist was badly sprained but not broken. They drove me back to the nearest town, where I got proper medical care and rest. Looking back, I realized how easy it was to make small mistakes that could turn dangerous in the wilderness. Losing the trail marker, trusting the GPS too much, and not paying attention to the surroundings had put me in serious trouble. But I survived because I stayed calm, used what I had, and kept moving. I learned a lot from this experience, how fragile safety can be in the wild, and how important it is to be prepared for anything. I still hike, but now I'm more careful. I double-check my gear, carry extra batteries and a physical map, and I never underestimate the power of nature. The mountains are beautiful, but they demand respect. This trip taught me that fear is natural but can be controlled, and that perseverance matters more than anything when you're alone and lost.